As our lives become busier and more complicated than ever, we could all use an escape here and there. That's why WDAV Classical Public Radio has curated a classical oasis that's a tap away anytime you need to breathe a sigh of relief. At the WDAV mobile app, you can stream WDAV's 24/7 classical music programming on demand from anywhere you are. Check out past episodes of shows that celebrate classical music's remarkable diversity, like WDAV's bilingual program Concierto and Noteworthy, the series hosted by yours truly. You'll also get access to a great variety of podcast episodes, blog articles, and more that shine a spotlight on the music and arts you love. Download the WDAV mobile app now at wdav.org/app, or if you're in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, tune your radio to 89.9 FM. Take a deep breath and enjoy. I'm Loki Karuna, and this is TRILLOQUY. Thanks so much for tuning in to this podcast built to decolonize classical music. I always appreciate your listenership. So in the journey toward decolonization, the topic of race has to come up. Longtime listeners to this show know that I've not only engaged race unapologetically, but have also evolved a little in my engagement of the topic. I'll talk a little about that in the triloquy of this opus and how that's popped up recently. But to get us there, I'm thrilled to welcome back to the podcast Boston-based musician Joe LaRocca. Joe is actually a multi-instrumentalist who makes his living doing musical theater. He does some pit work and on stage work. And just like many corners of the arts, there is a diversity problem that's ongoing. We talk about diversity in orchestras a lot, but not so much within pit orchestras. And Joe calls this out. His primary medium for his activism has been written word. I have a link to his and a couple of other Substacks in the description for you to check out. But he joins me here today to talk about what this work has looked like for him, why he's dived into it, why he believes it's a problem in the first place, and what he thinks can be done to solve these issues, all for the benefit of audiences and to the art form of musical theater overall. To get you into our chat, here's a clip of a performance from Joe. This is a work by Robert Anton Strobel, commissioned and performed by Joe LaRocca. It's called Vortex Soup. More from me after the dialogue. Hope you enjoy.
If we think about just staged performances of musicals as an art form, it fuses so many things that are excessively relatable to a large swath of people. Now, it combines music and narrative and, at the end of the day, people just love actors. They love seeing them. And when you combine that with something that's even more loved by people, arguably, or just as loved by people in the music sense, especially music that really people resonate with. And especially in the last decade or two, I mean, really since the early 2000s, people have been getting really creative in terms of what music is being featured. Because I think when we think about musical theater, there is sort of a hermetically sealed kind of style to it. But then people really started, I think about David Yazbek, for example, who wrote The Band's Visit is a really good example of that. And it was just fusing like Arabic music and Jewish music and pop and kind of jazzy stuff in a way that was really creative. And there's a whole ton of shows like that. And so I think it's the art form is just so expansive, and there are so many ways of doing it that it ends up being extremely relatable to people. And not to mention, just the commercial success of so many of these things. I mean, one can talk about, I think it's really easy for people to say that, musical theater as a style is just too commercial. And I would argue that, there's plenty of, I mean, some of my favorite shows are really niche things that either didn't last long on Broadway or didn't go to Broadway. But that doesn't mean I don't love stuff like Phantom or
Hmm.
Lion King, which deserves its place for sure in a myriad of ways. Um, and there's certainly a whole lot of things you could say about, labor disputes and, who's at the top of the heap when it comes to the money being made on Broadway. You can say a lot about that. But when it comes to it as an art form, and, you certainly have a lot of sort of, popular IP, public domain cash grabs that are happening a lot, and, just sort of schlock that's being put out there. And I think you can say that about just about any commercial art, any commercially successful art form, but I think the reason it resonates with people so much is because people have really, really been leaning into the artistry of it as well as the sort of to the commercial end of it. And you just see a whole array of things that are really quite they're really quite interesting and relatable to people.
I wonder what keeps live musicians in the mix as we're talking about relevancy. I mean, these people who just go and see these shows, I'm sure they would buy tickets if it was just a track. I wonder why, from your perspective, that investment in live musicians is still a part of this.
Oh, let me tell you, they wouldn't. They wouldn't. There was a show. What was it called? It was a David Byrne musical that went on Broadway, and it was about karaoke in the Philippines, I think. I might be totally wrong, but one of those is Southeast Asian country where karaoke is huge, right? And so they thought, we should be doing karaoke. However, there is a standing rule on Broadway that if you're going to do a musical, you have to use live musicians. And if
Hmm.
that precedent is broken, that just has a cascading effect. But the people who really took the reins on speaking out were audience members. They were outraged, and they went on Facebook and, all these platforms and just ripped into them. And it really was a bad PR situation for that theater and for David Byrne and for everybody like that. And they kept making excuses. They're like, "Oh, it's karaoke, it's karaoke." I'm like, "Yeah, don't don't piss on my shoe and tell me it's raining." I mean, there was a producer in there who said, ching ching, we don't have to hire musicians now,
Hmm.
because everybody loves live musicians. And David Byrne was a wonderful example, I mean, of using actor musicians in one of his shows. And I'm so bad at remembering names of things sometimes. There's so many shows out there. American Dream or something like that. I don't remember what it was called, but in any case, um so yeah, the audience members are really the ones, and they love seeing it, and they notice the difference, especially with this New York crowd who are just these people who love going seeing Broadway shows. They understand. You got to give the audience some credit. They really understand the push and pull and the organic nature of a human that can listen to the person that's on stage and make adjustments and match their phrasing, and they understand. And that's what makes a live experience in all of its forms so interesting on a human level, is that it's the risk factor. It's the imperfections of it that make it so wonderful. So yeah, really got to give the audience some credit. And there are a lot of people who wouldn't know the difference, but there are just as many, if not more, people who do know the difference.
Well, that's great news, and thanks for checking me there. But with that considered, there are these rules and regulations. I'm thinking about unions that protect these musicians from certain outside forces. But what protects pit musicians, musical theater musicians from each other? I mean, there's so much status quo that I feel like is upheld by the musician who's been doing this show for 30 years. What's in place to deal with those sorts of challenges?
Nothing. um, really it's all about the individual contractors for theaters and of course the producers of these theaters who are in charge of hiring them. But one of the biggest issues is that, there are tons of contractors out there, don't get me wrong, who do wonderful work, who, kind of abide by the mission of the theater and do everything they can to like cast a wide net and, hire appropriate people and don't just go by some, kind of capricious first call list that's often more based on, closeness to the individual rather than, artistic fit for every
Hmm.
single show, right? There are plenty of people doing good work on there, but there's really no concrete system in place through the union or through through most individual theaters to have a check on those contractors, right? Um, and musicians themselves, even if they, kind of witness, homogeneity, or anything like that in the pit, or just kind of unfair hiring practices, are too afraid to say anything because that can get you blacklisted, truly.
Hmm.
Um, and this is why I've started writing about this.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that work. We're definitely going to get back into that. But just to give folks a little bit of background on you, this is your third time appearing on the TRILLOQUY podcast. We've covered
Yeah.
lots of ground. I wonder if you could give folks just a little background on how your work has intersected generally with justice, with anti-racism. How's your work as a musician led you to where you are now, pertaining to the conversation we're going to have?
Yeah, I mean, we spoke first. It was so funny because I totally forgot about that first meeting we had. And that was when I was with the Du Bois Orchestra.
Hmm.
And the Du Bois Orchestra, for folks that don't know, is an orchestra in Cambridge, Mass, that was founded in 2015, basically in response to sort of racism in seating of musicians in the Dudley House Orchestra at Harvard. And there were a few folks who left the Dudley House Orchestra, made their own orchestra in 2015 called the Du Bois Orchestra. And it was originally like a Harvard student orchestra that ended up becoming its own 501(c)(3) and all that stuff. And it's dedicated to elevating the voices of historically marginalized composers, particularly black composers and women composers. And it still exists today, and wonderful things are being done. And in my time there, we even unearthed a Florence Price piece called Abraham Lincoln Walks at Midnight. That was a choral piece, an orchestrated choral piece that was just wonderful. I mean, we had the handwritten manuscript that had been scanned at the University of Arkansas, and I typeset it myself. And so if anybody rents it, that's my work typesetting, and I apologize in advance because there's probably a lot of errors. I'm not a professional music copyist. But okay, I did some work with that. And I was their personnel director for a while when it was like a volunteer orchestra, and then eventually became executive director, and sort of left when I was touring with the Jesus Christ Superstar National Tour as a pit musician because I just couldn't straddle both worlds. So I ended up leaving the organization. But it felt really good to do something that really I think was a good foundation of fostering change, and all over the country now people are performing Florence Price when at the time it started you haven't even heard of her or all these other historically marginalized composers. Now I think the classical world still has a lot of work to do, but I like to believe that I was a part of that a little bit. But then as a as an artist, as a performer, theater ended up calling my name, so I haven't really been a part of the classical world that much since then. Um, but I've been really trying to find a way to, find a way to affect positive change in a way that I could actually do, right? Because there's so many things. I mean, we're so inundated with information about this, that, or the other, and all these huge systemic issues and all that stuff that I really had to say, okay, I need to sit down and find a way to affect positive change that will actually work, right? That I could actually have be possible, and the theater and within the theater world is the way I found to do that nowadays.
Are you happier in the theater world? You mentioned being a bit displaced from the classical world. Are you, aside from the issues that we'll talk about here shortly, is it a better existence for you?
Yes, for me, it is a better existence. And I'm not going to sit here and say that it's a better art form. No way. I mean, it's just for different people. And for me, it was like I enjoy, man, I really thoroughly enjoy performing classical music. I am glad that I trained as a classical musician. Um, but when it came down to making money, which
Hmm.
is, what we needed to do, it was just not working out for me. I knew I wanted to stay in Boston. I knew that in order for me to I just started getting gigs doing theater stuff as a woodwind doubler, and and then I just kind of fell in love with the art form. And really, it was kind of like a bidding war all of a sudden. It's like any classical gig that I got offered, it just didn't pay as much. So that was a necessity at the time. Because I wasn't teaching or anything. I was fresh off tour and I was used to getting paid a lot for my work, and I was kind of going from that direction. And so after a while, it just became, oh, Joe's the theater guy, right? And so that's what I was kind
Hmm.
of stuck in, even if I tried to do some classical stuff. But really, what happened was that I fell in love with the art form. I love the fact that we could all tell a story here. And even though I'm kind of buried down in the pit most of the time, you're really supporting the narrative with your artistic, brilliance or knowledge or whatever as a musician. You think about like even just kind of playing a unison flute line with a soprano on stage and matching their phrasing and in order to tell a story that really captivates people. I think about what I was doing when I was in grad school, when I was doing an artist diploma at Longy here in Boston, and I was doing performances. I was doing my recitals that were basically one man shows because I was interspersing little kind of satirical skits in there and videos that I had made. And I had made like a shot for shot remake of a promotional video that Longy did that I thought was kind of corny, and like then I just remade it totally.
Hmm.
And some people in the PR department weren't happy with me, but everyone thought it was just hilarious. It was a gentle poking at their foibles for sure. It wasn't like anything devastating, but and that was interspersed with music from tons of different genres. I mean, just like a Baroque piece and like a jazzy thing and a Venezuelan piece and a straight up classical piece and stuff like that. And that was what I realized. What was happening was I was doing theater. And that's so that when I got into that world, um, and especially starting to be invited more on stage, I was like, oh, okay, this is what I've been looking for.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that you described yourself as being buried down in the pit most of the time. I would love
Hmm.
to acknowledge your onstage work. What does that look like and felt like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to keep the story short and how that started, but really when I started touring is when I caught the bug because they invited me just to play a saxophone solo on stage in Jesus Christ Superstar for like 10 seconds. But that alone was like enough. It's like I want to do this. We were on stage the whole time, visible, but just kind of up on a riser, just sitting and playing. But even that little bit of being on my feet and interacting a little bit with the cast, I was like, this is what I want to do. So I started kind of, doing more things on stage. I had done a play called the Lehman Trilogy. That was this big long play that was just an onstage musician with no lines, but playing along with the track for a lot of things and kind of interacting with the cast. And I realized I had a true gift for having a presence on stage, and not being distracting. And then I started just taking some auditions, and I did some plays, and I was in some musicals that were required being on stage, like the Band's Visit at Huntington Theater was one of them, where I was playing the woodwind book. But again, we were just on stage a lot and present. Um, and then I got invited, and the first big thing I did when it came to an actor musician thing was it was called A Man of No Importance at Speakeasy Stage, and I played a few character actor roles while also doing the woodwind book, and it was just the best time of my life. It was unbelievably transformational, and it was really funny because I was playing like the flute player. I was playing flutes and tin whistles and Irish flutes. There was like 12 instruments overall, but then I had to go get into a police uniform and be this like homophobic Irish, police officer who kind of tisks at like the main character getting beaten, and then being his boss who's like a jerk, and then being a heckler at the pub. So it was an interesting kind of dichotomy there, but it was so fun. Um, and then I did Eddie Carbone in A View from the Bridge, which is just a straight play, and that really gave me the confidence to do some heavy acting. And so now, a lot of the stuff that I really look for as an individual is more of that actor musician kind of stuff. So
Well, excellent. Yeah, congrats on that trajectory. I think that's really phenomenal. So to get us to the main topic at hand, talking about these issues in the pit, I have to admit that there's more dialogue around instrumental music in written spaces than I realized. We all know about the podcasts and those sorts of things, but areas, mediums like Substack are ones that I wasn't largely familiar with until I started preparing for this dialogue. I'm just curious, generally speaking, how are you measuring impact on a medium like Substack? I know that this has been huge for you, but do you feel like people are reading? Are you seeing reactions to what's out there?
yeah, the good thing about Substack is that it doesn't have that like Facebook stink of of the algorithm kind of pushing down stuff like that. And kind of being really opaque about, who it actually reaches. It's, practitioners talking to practitioners. I find that I have about 125 subscribers at this point, and pretty much all of them are fellow musicians. A lot of them classical musicians, actually, and people, and then of course like pit musicians and stuff like that. But mostly musicians. I noticed like a few like theater producers and something like that. But really the reach, because a lot of the writing that I'm doing is very inside baseball and like very talking to musicians. Um, and it's been a wonderful resource for connecting with people who are also actively speaking out and using Substack as a platform to kind of, transfer over their individual blogs and the stuff that they've been doing on Facebook. Catherine Needleman was a huge example of that, and she's one of like the rising
Mm-hmm.
stars on Substack, and that's been a very good opportunity for her, and it's a good way to monetize the writing. I'm not going to monetize any of my writing because I'm not that good of a writer, but like um, Catherine Needleman is fantastic voice, and she deserves to be paid for the work that she's doing, and so that's a really good way of doing that. So yeah, but she does, although she does throw out a lot of, if you ask for a free, subscription, she'll give it to you. As long as you ask politely and don't make her mad. No, but, um, so yeah, it's just a really good platform. I mean, I was so frustrated of screaming into the Facebook void. I really needed something that I felt like was, a little bit more concrete and could, and it was interesting because when I first got into it, I really wanted it to be like a living, breathing document of the things that I believed, right? Because I was like, getting into so many conversations with colleagues in theater about all these opinions that I had, and it would just end up being like me info dumping on people at work, which is
Mm-hmm.
like, during
Mm-hmm.
tech week for a show, it's like that's the last place somebody wants to be hearing about like labor issues and stuff. So
Sure.
I was just, nowadays when I get into that conversation, it's like, okay, well, here's this doc. I didn't expect anybody to subscribe and read, but it kind of blew up bigger than I really thought. So.
I mean, and it seems like the piece that did that for you was the one that you titled "Casting the Pit." That clearly resonated with people. I wonder if you could talk about what triggered that piece specifically.
Yeah, there was a few things. I mean, it was really years of pattern recognition within this field that I was attempting to navigate as a professional, right? The series itself is called A View from the Pit. It was just saying like these are my uh, views as being a pit musician, right? Um, and when I started witnessing a lot of artistic mismatch in hiring, particularly within union gigs, meaning, high paid union contract gigs in theaters. I was starting to be like, well, what's the criteria here? Because I was lucky enough to get hired early on after I came back from tour. I think having a tour credit really helped in a lot of ways, and just playing a lot of weird instruments and stuff. So there was that, and also being a cis het white male. I mean, that really helped. But I started just seeing these patterns and just kind of getting a little bit frustrated, and noticing too that there wasn't any real transparency when it came to not only how to get in touch with folks to get hired with contractors and MDs and stuff like that, but there was really no transparency in what those criteria were. I mean, we think
Mm.
about like how symphony orchestras audition, and for all the challenges there, I mean, there's, a lot of people aren't doing it perfectly, right? But at least there have been efforts, and at least there's been transparency to say we're trying things. There's absolutely nothing when it comes to hiring in musical theater pits. And in just talking with colleagues, particularly women colleagues and colleagues of color and, LGBTQ folks, there was just a frustration there with a lot of folks. And I remember what catalyzed this to start writing was a post that I saw on Catherine Needleman's Facebook page, where somebody had written in just showing a bunch of pictures from a local contractor to her, I believe in one of the Carolinas somewhere. And it was just the white cishet male homogeneity of those hires were just so obvious. It was
Hmm.
insane. So there was a lot of back and forth, and even that contractor whose photos those belonged to really, it's like, chimed in, and there was a big back and forth there. And I wrote Catherine and I said, it's not that much different here in Boston. And she said, well, if you write about it on Substack or something, I'll share it. And so I was like, okay. And it really scared me, right?
Mm.
Because I was like, this, if people who might hire me read this, it's going to be, I could potentially get blacklisted. But then she had said something that really struck me, in saying that, like, if you're afraid that the people who are hiring you will blacklist you for speaking out about these things, think about what that means, that you're
Exactly.
afraid of that. And it just set off an alarm bell in me. I was like, you're right. You're right. If I'm like taking these paychecks and not saying anything because I'm afraid, then I am, I'm like that white moderate that MLK used to talk about. The white
Right.
moderate is the biggest stumbling block, even more than a KKK member or Nazi. You know what I mean? It's the people
And
who
and
will
his
allow it
words,
to.
just in case people don't know.
Yes, right. Um, And so in this case, it's really that. I mean, I was the problem, And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to stop being the problem. I'm going to start speaking out here. And so that's what catalyzed it. And really, too, it was a thing of like, you know, uh, certain gigs coming up, even that, and honestly, and I just want to be completely transparent about it too, is that, like, I also had frustrations of my own, that there were gigs that I knew I was perfect for. I knew that I was qualified for, but was passed over because it was like, oh, well, we have to respect the first call guy. And then I kept asking, like, how is the first call guy chosen? What is the criteria? What makes these, what makes this happen? And it was really a thing of like, because I said so, right?
Hmm.
That's what it came down to. Don't ask questions and don't cause drama, right? And basically, don't cause drama meant don't ask any questions. So that's what caused me to start write that piece.
And I just want to name that while in the world of opera, you have the onstage pit dynamic, it's still different because those regulations more closely aligned with the orchestral world than the musical theater world. I think, some
Mm.
people will see musicians in a pit and think that the circumstances are the same across genre, but I think that's a great example to note of the specific challenge within musical theater among different types of musical experiences that require pit musicians.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're referring more to like sort of the differences in sort of style that come up a lot when it comes to musical theater?
really just naming the fact that, again, the issues that you're speaking to, while there are other mediums that require a pit with musicians in it, it sounds
Oh,
like
yes.
musical theater specifically, in that diversity of mediums that require pit musicians for musical theater, this is really where the issue is hot. At
Yes.
least that's my sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, because with opera pits it's more like a symphony orchestra, right?
Hmm.
They hold auditions for these specific seats, and for as imperfect as it is, at least there's a system. you know for musical theater pits there simply is no system, in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in most cases.
Hmm. Hmm. One of the points that you make in your piece, casting the pit, is that this idea of being qualified is sort of
Mm,
blurry, and we don't really
mm.
talk about that. I wonder if you could, speak to this idea of qualification as it relates to the issue that you're dealing with, because it's more than just being a world-class musician. Generally speaking, there are nuances that are required to deliver certain, musical theater works as opposed to other musical theater works. It's not just one giant wash of being technically proficient that we see more on the classical side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting with with being a classical musician is that's what you're dealing with, being a classical musician, right? And there's certainly variations in there in terms of technical skill that you need. I mean, there are people who are probably stronger at playing new music, and there are probably people who are stronger at playing early music, but in general, it kind of stays within that Western concert music scope. But when you're talking about musical theater, one has to, I mean, there's so many skills that you have to have in terms of being proficient in multiple genres, right? You have to be able to convincingly play, basically a big band chart while simultaneously playing a very classical book, while also then, playing a Celtic piece or something in sort of African style or West African style or some kind of Indian styles and so, sort of Hindustani classical music type of stuff. I mean,
Hmm.
it all kind of fits in there, and you have to be able to, on a dime, switch up those styles. And not only that, but double on different instruments too. And this is the thing that a lot of people don't realize is that, especially woodwind players, we end up playing tons of different instruments. I've seen books that have like 19 different instruments in
Wow.
them. And that often comes from just playing, keyless flutes. And so they need them in all different keys. But that's the challenge of it too, is that musical theater loves to modulate. It loves to change keys. And so you can be playing in C major on a flute in a nice, lovely place, and then suddenly you're playing in C sharp on a clarinet, it's like, or and then suddenly switching to bassoon and playing in some other random key, um, and not only that, but it requires you're basically a collaborative, uh, like an accompanist for who's on stage, and so you have to have three different sets of ears and four different sets of eyes. You have to and realize that, like, to air is human, and there's a ton of different moving parts when it comes to the production. And so there's always going to be things that change. And so you have to be able to adapt to that. And often there's more and more cases of having to be able to improvise in multiple genres as well. And
Hmm.
so it really just takes a lot of versatility. And which a lot of people aren't trained for in the conservatory system. Um, so a lot of people just kind of have to learn by doing and start doing theater pits and but then also going out and sort of paying respect to styles and really deeply studying them. So yeah.
One of the questions that was coming to mind as I was preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about this space between musicians who are uniquely qualified to play. I'm just going to throw out an example. So you mentioned the Lion King earlier. There are
Mm-hmm.
certain types of flutes, certain types of drums that a person
Mm-hmm.
needs to have that cultural understanding of to effectively deliver what they need. Is the conversation more about training the quote unquote old guard in those new styles? Or do we need to focus on the people who haven't always been included, who come to the table with those skills, making sure that they're to the front? I wonder how you think about the balance between those two engagements of this conversation.
Sure. And I think more thought, the fact that we're having this conversation is a wonderful thing and asking that question, because the fact is that it always falls on right now that, yes, train the old guard players, the vast majority like in the 20th century of people, especially now, who are playing in theater pits are jazz musicians who used to tour a lot. There's no
Hmm.
such thing as a touring big band anymore, really. I mean, jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra is basically all you got at this point. So, all of these players suddenly had nowhere to go. There was really nowhere to make money, right? And so they all ended up falling into theater pits. And it makes sense because jazz players are incredibly diverse musicians and incredible readers. I mean,
Hmm.
Jesus, and and so you have a lot of homogeneity in that respect. And so a lot of these old guard players are jazz musicians, right? And it makes a lot of sense because their ears are open and all that kind of stuff. But just like the classical hierarchy, and I think this is a symptom of sort of conservatory hierarchical thinking, is that, it's like jazz is the most important thing. You don't really have to pay
Hmm.
attention to other things because if you can play jazz, you can do anything. Just like people say, oh, you can sing opera, you can sing anything. Or if you play, if you can play Brahms violin concerto, you can play anything, which is simply not the case. I mean, you can play it, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll respect the style, in a
Right.
way that actually, is reverent to the tendencies of the style without kind of breaking your classical thing. Um, so there's that. But my thinking is that, it depends on the show, really, when it comes to your question. Um, I think there's certain things, certain shows that might require a really, really high level of reading ability that some folks might not have. But I think there needs to be sort of a casting a wider net in saying to ourselves, there might be people who specialize in these forms who are also excellent readers, who are also sort of have a high level of the kind of musical training that is necessary in musical theater. But then there's also a thing of like, let's take these people who specialize in these styles and hey, train them, and so that we are paying full respect to the style, that we are inviting the musical element of it into the dramaturgy of the show in a way that's 100% respectful to the style, to the culture, and then also providing opportunities for musicians who may not have had that opportunity because of that specialization, right? Again, it depends on the show and it depends on the sort of constraints of the production, but these are things that people I feel like should keep in mind.
I mean, because I feel like the argument that a lot of the quote unquote old guard will take is that the tenured orchestral musician has their gig. They don't have to
Mhm.
worry about being hired over and over again. They just have it. And these pit musicians who are arguably more quote unquote qualified, they have a broader set of skills. They have to fight for their job after 30, 40 years, because I definitely
Mhm.
understand and agree with the point that you make. I also try to put myself, for the sake of, really understanding the dialogue, put myself in the shoes of that person who's been playing this one show on Broadway for 35 years and doesn't want to be ousted by, this hot shot from Curtis or
Right.
whatever. So I wonder, how do we really make this fair? What is really on the other side of this challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. And I line that out in one of my pieces called The Ultimate Guide for Ethical Pit Musician Hiring in Musicals. Is that I basically have two systems that I feel like any contractor can adopt. One is called the casting system, and it's just how it sounds. It's like you hire based on the show and you get people competing for each show and then just have the different stylistic fit for every single one. This makes sense for theaters that have a big diversity in terms of the kind of shows that they play or self-producing houses and stuff like that. However, in the case of one's theaters that might have had these like first call old guard players that have been around for a long time and want to retain that, I have the resident system, which actually the Muni in St. Louis adopts very, very well. What they do is they audition when a seat opens up for an in-house, uh, you know, trumpet player, percussionist, woodwind doubler, so that when it comes up, that's the person who it is. There's a transparent system for it. Everyone who wants it can be heard. There's an audition process and an application process, a CV check. It's all completely open and it's transparent, right? And people know what it is. Whereas right now, what you have is these, basically first call players for every show that comes in, and nobody knows how they got there, And
Hmm.
often what ends up happening is it really opens up the door for unconscious bias, right? It's not a coincidence that most of the people who end up in these first call positions end up looking and acting like the people who hired them. That's what unconscious bias is. But when it comes to a long running show, yes, whoever is on that show just deserves to be on that show, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the next show that's going to happen in that theater, it's going to automatically be them, right? But that's the thing, though. It's like if you're a veteran player, you already have a huge advantage, right? Because when it comes to a process that takes all of these things into account, experience is going to be a big thing. So, and I also want to make this perfectly clear is that I don't think it's right for, say, a theater who has a certain first call player who gets, automatically chosen for every bit of work to get everything at the exclusion of everybody else, right? Like one
Hmm.
person shouldn't get everything while everybody else gets absolutely nothing or just scraps, right? Um, but then I think it's a good thing for these veteran players to sort of be engaging in a system that sort of provides mentorship, and I think that when it comes to an individual musician who who might be in that position where they're a first call player and don't want to lose that, I think the reason that they hold on so tightly and often in a very Machiavellian way to that is because they had to struggle themselves. They're like,
Right.
when I was in my 20s and 30s and even 40s, I had to be the one to wait for these old guard players to go away. Um, while I was sitting here picking up the scraps, and now it's my turn, right? But if
Hmm.
we had a system set up where it was more like a mentorship, people would feel better about letting go of these things because it's like, oh, look, this is somebody who I helped, right? And it's just more community centric and it's just more artistically friendly rather than just cutthroat and Machiavellian and stuff like that.
And I want to make sure that we're really naming the thing. You talk about
Mm.
these first call musicians who come out of nowhere and they end up looking like the contractor or the person that hired them.
Hmm.
I don't think we're talking about musical theaters where the pit is being overrun by women who only hire women, or black people that only hire black people. What are we really specifically talking about?
Yes, what we're talking about is a homogeneity of overwhelmingly cis hetero white men in pit orchestra hiring. Now let me tell you, there are contractors. There was like one contractor in particular in Chicago who recently hired for a show, did a wonderful job. Hiring more black musicians, more women musicians. New York, there's plenty of contractors who are doing a good job. However, nationally, and I say mostly just the US. I only know about the United States. Is that the vast majority of these musicians, you see more often than not that they're pretty much all hetero white men. Um, and the reason for this is because it's been an insular echo chamber for a very long time. In an interaction I was witnessing, I had referenced Catherine Needleman earlier in a post that she had made about this trend that was noticed by someone, who she reposted. That contractor had, who happens to be a white man, had, contacted her. One of the things he said that was very revealing, and it was supposed to be a defense of his position, which ended up being a huge self-report, was saying that your audition is the last gig you played for me, and the reason you get that first gig is because somebody recommended you. And that was supposed to be a big defense of that. I'm like, if you don't understand how problematic just openly admitting that is, then you don't belong in that position, right? But that happens to be the position of pretty much every contractor in this, sorry, theater musician contractor in this country right now. And that's the result. I mean, this isn't just an anecdote of mine. I mean, ask anybody, any woman, any person of color, any LGBTQ person in the field right now and ask if they're happy, and then just go to the Theater Musician Association pages for each local. Houston has one, Chicago Theater Musician Association, Boston TMA. Just scroll down the list and tell me who the majority is. And let me tell you something is that a lot of these contractors will say, well, I've never turned down a woman or a piece of or a person of color for for being a woman or a piece of color. I just hired the most qualified person. I would believe that if at any one time any of these contractors hired a pit that was mostly women or all people of color, and then I would believe that it's a fluke. But it's not a fluke. It's a systemic issue that needs to be addressed now.
So what's the answer? Open auditions like orchestras do, open calls?
Yeah, and so again, that's another thing is that, auditions and open auditions have their own set of things. But what I've proposed and what I've extensively written about is all of the options that people have. There's a million things you can do that will immediately make things a lot better. You can publish the pathway to getting hired on theaters' websites, right? And not just the union website, right? To where you have to start paying dues and all that to get this information. Publish it. All you have to and have a open submission form so that you can submit your materials to contractors. Decision dates, and saying like, hey, if you hadn't heard back by this time, it means you didn't get hired for the show. Um, having open calls for auditions. And now this is this is another chestnut because live auditions, I mean, that's a whole nother podcast is talking about how the effectiveness of live auditions, right? And sort
Mm-hmm.
of all the, implications that go around in that. But at least having a system to where people can, openly submit to contractors and to theaters and to at least be heard and to know who is, being hired and what criteria there is and what the individual needs are and stuff like that. And so, there's a contracting company in New York. It's called M Squared.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, and they do a wonderful job in that because what they have on their website, it's like, hey, if you want to be considered, you they basically have a system where you can not only submit your materials, but then you have a login to where you can then update your materials. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just a really good way of doing it. They just have a very transparent database instead of just a Rolodex of their own of people that they know individually. Um, so those are things that are already being done by some folks that could be done by everybody. But I can go deep and deep and deep into the things that can be done. But I have it very specifically lined out in my piece, The Ultimate Guide for Pit Orchestra Hiring on my Substack. And they're all just very concrete things that theater producers can start implementing immediately that would not only make things more fair and more transparent and cast a wider net and increase diversity, but it would also just increase artistic excellence, and really help the art. Because you're hurting the art when you allow artistic mismatches to happen, right? When you allow the same racist and sexist hiring practices to go unchecked for so long. Obviously it's ethical concern, but you're really hurting the art as well. Um, and so, people, it's immediately affordable and actionable. So yeah.
When as someone who spends most of my time thinking about composers and new music, I've often had to engage the conversation of the responsibility of conductors, but it not only falling on the lap of conductors. There are more musicians, there are more orchestral musicians who oppose new music and living composers
Yeah.
than there are conductors. And I think that's a conversation that we need to have, a musician's role in impeding the success not only of any given individual composer, but the overall engagement of new music in orchestral spaces. I mentioned that to attempt to build a parallel to what we're talking about, because I understand that contractors hold a lot of power, but this issue can't wholly be to blame on the contractors. I mean, I wonder from your perspective, what role do these non-contracting musicians play in the status quo and in this conversation?
Oh yeah. I mean, again, that goes back to our white moderate standpoint, you know, um, is that if you're taking a paycheck and not and noticing these trends and not saying anything, then you're really part of the problem. And I say that as a person who has had deep fear, deep fear about losing my opportunity to work and being blacklisted. You don't have to be afraid anymore. If we all do it, they can't blacklist all of us, you know. Um, and you know, it's really as simple as that. You know, it's there's not much further I can elaborate on it in that sense. I think it's quite simple.
And I think as an extension, I also think about the fact, considering the world that we live in, you can't legislate peace. You can't
Mm,
legislate anti-bigotry. That's just something that has to happen in people's hearts. And, that
sure.
comes from dialogues with people, being in community, being open to, engaging with people who you might disagree with, or whatever it might be. So again, with that mentioned, what is our pathway? What do you see as your pathway to success, to equitable change? It seems like it's similar to what I'm saying about a change of the heart, unless you do see a
Yes.
world in which there are rules or regulations that could be put in place to fix this.
I think a hybrid, certainly, because I think those two things could support one another. Um, I think about it this way. Okay, so when it comes to contractors and musicians, from a bureaucratic standpoint, it is a separate entity because everyone there is contracted. They're not necessarily like full on employees of the theater, right? And so it's usually the case of like, okay, we need these musicians. You have carte blanche to choose whoever you want, right? That needs to change. There's little to no oversight. You know, it's sometimes a thing of like, oh, hey, do you happen to have more? You know, because a lot of these theaters have been amazing, amazing, doing like making massive strides, can do better, but making massive strides in elevating the voices of historically marginalized people in the theater space, right? In telling more Black stories and telling more stories around women and LGBTQ folks and people like that. Um, but they just need to take those conversations and invite the musicians into them.
Mm.
And of course, contractors aren't fully to blame. I mean, because there are tons of great contractors out there who are doing great work on their own, but it needs to be the case that I think there needs to be a culture built around inviting musicians more into the dramaturgy of the show, you know, inviting them earlier in the process, not only in the sense of just each individual show, but inviting them into the mission of the theater and really having those open dialogues and not just pointing the finger and saying you're doing this and you're doing that, because I truly don't believe that any of these contractors are just simply, I mean, some of them are, but not, a lot of them aren't just, you know, hateful people or racist and sexist
Mm-hmm.
people. You know, I don't think because it takes a different form nowadays. It takes the form of of unconscious bias, and it needs to be addressed in a way of saying like, hey, you know, we notice this trend. Let's talk about it. You know, let's have a conversation and figure out what we can do and put some systems in place to where we're casting a wider net. Um, and you know, when people start responding with, oh, well, what you want me to hire unqualified people who, you know, just because they're women, just because they're people of color, and responding then saying, no, we just need to cast a wider net, you know, and find out ways of making this process more transparent and, you know, organically uh making the theater pit more in line with the mission of the theater and truly the musician or sorry, truly the mission of a more progressive society at large.
Yep, and I think that the point that you were just making there has to be stated out loud as much as possible. This is not about hiring anyone who is unqualified. It's about broadening the pool of qualified people, especially considering the diversity of musical theater. As you know, as the point that you've been making over and over again, there are Western European aesthetics in musical theater. There's also
Hmm.
those West African aesthetics. You know, the Southeast Asian instruments that we were
Hmm.
talking about before we started recording. Those play a role in musical theater. So, I think again that the argument is about broadening the pool of those people who are qualified and not bringing anyone
Hmm.
who's unqualified. And that's an
Absolutely.
obvious thing to a lot of people, but again, I think it has to be stated out loud because it's very easy for people to see this conversation as getting unqualified people into these seats just for the sake of diversity.
Absolutely. And that's the first thing that comes up. That's the big snapback at whenever I talk about this stuff to an established person, right? In fact, I have a whole piece about all of the arguments that I've heard about the pushback of this stuff, and it's all written out there and all delicately and thoughtfully answered.
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I mean, really, it has to be a slow burn. I mean, we can't, I think when it comes to arts organizations, basically what happened after the pandemic was the NEA stepped in and said, like, especially to theaters. I don't know if this was the classical music world as well, but they said, like, you all have to start walking the walk when it comes to diversity, or else we're going to cut your funding. And so I
Right.
think a lot of this conversation has sort of been tainted by a lot of disingenuous box checking, and not real efforts to, like, from our hearts, have this conversation and make real meaningful progress that really is a slow burn and not something you could just immediately fix right away. The culture has to change, and you have to put systems in place to where the ship gets just nudged by a degree, so then you're miles away years down the line. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Those are the effective changes, because otherwise you're going to get too much pushback. You're going to get people, especially established people, who are going to get way too defensive and have ammo against overly clinical or ineffective efforts, by organizations. So but that is to say, like, good things are happening, but just we just need to have more of these conversations. That's all.
What's your call to action for the patrons, for audience members in
Look
this
in
dialogue?
Yes, look inside the pit. Look inside the pits, and don't ask the musicians nothing. No, I'm kidding. But, like, no, I think when it comes to the patrons, yeah, look inside the pit and, like, look at the press photos and stuff like that, and just notice what's going on. I mean, if it happens to be all white men in there, just, like, send a little letter to the producer. It's all on there, like, or the artistic director, and say, like, hey, I noticed that this is particularly heavy in white men, this production. Like, why is that? I'm curious to know. And really speaking to the artistic leadership of the entire theater. And I would also call upon musicians as well. If you notice those things, like, go to the artistic leadership of the theater. You're an employee of that theater, even if you are contracted by them. It's like you have certain rights. Don't talk to the contractor. Like, if you notice certain things, like, go right to their boss. It is okay. And it's not a thing of, like, pointing the finger or accusing, just being like, hey, I noticed this trend. And it's just about having conversations and being human to each other. It's really sad to say.
Joe LaRocca there with the NIU Middle Eastern Music Ensemble. He's a multi-talented musician, as you can hear him there on flute, and he's also doing his part to cultivate some equity within his corner of the arts. As I mentioned during our dialogue, we don't always think about diversity as it relates to pit musicians, so I'm glad that this conversation is happening. You can learn more about Joe and check out some of his work in the links in the description. Okay, so this conversation of race can be really uncomfortable for people. It's one of the reasons I started this show with Scott Blankenship back in 2019. There were conversations that people were shying away from that needed a spotlight, especially in the arts. Before I took on my Buddhist practice, I talk about race quite frankly, white people in particular, in a very accusatory way. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't people who need to be accused, because there certainly are. But when I started focusing my spirit on the radical humanism that is core to Nietzsche and Buddhism, my approach had to soften up a bit. And quite naturally, it wasn't an intentional shift I made. It was simply the result of a change in my own heart. But as I've continued in my work on and away from the microphone, I've had to deal with some deeply internalized resentments that have grown within me over the course of my life, based on where we are as a country. I can't tell you the traumas that I've had to really face and think about from my childhood, realizing, for example, that many interactions with my friends' parents were absolutely racist. I've spoken at length on this show how the conditioning shows up within music education, just the inherent racism. And of course, we have what's going on in the political arena today. There were conservative influencers all over the internet in unapologetic blackface this Halloween, among the narratives that make it feel like we're closer to the 1940s than not. It's all a lot and it's heavy. And I can't lie, it's been a challenge sometimes to figure out how to continue having these dialogues without perpetuating harm and division. These thoughts came up for me in a big way this week here in New York, and that's what I want to just share a little bit about in this triloquy. So, as everyone knows, we just elected the city's first Muslim mayor, the Honorable Zoran Mamdani. I, like many other folks who live here, I was really thrilled to support him and to see him win, but his connection to Black communities hasn't been the strongest over his campaign. There are several interviews that you can look up where he talks about his strategies for engaging immigrant communities and how he's had to put a different sort of intentionality around engaging non-immigrant communities of color, namely us Black folk. The man won, and we're all celebrating. It's good news. So clearly there was significant support that he ended up getting. But in his acceptance speech, he celebrated the fact that a city built by immigrants would soon be managed by an immigrant. And that's where my eyebrow raises. New York, like the vast majority of the East Coast and American South, was built by enslaved Africans. Immigrants played a vital role in much of the American infrastructure, of course, but when we fail to acknowledge Black people's role in building a place like New York City, it drives that divide between Black folks and immigrant communities wider and wider. I remember early in his campaign, there was messaging out there where he was saying, well, we tried a Black mayor, so why not now an immigrant mayor? I think that's been scrubbed from the internet, but that was my first engagement with him. And I wasn't sure if this was somebody that I could support at the time. Now that, that has shifted. He did get my support, but that's, it still leaves me and folks who think like me in a tricky emotional position. On one hand, I feel like I've been conditioned not to speak on statements like immigrants built New York because people consider that divisive. But why is it okay for very well-meaning people to say things that perpetuate Black marginalization without any pushback? I did repost someone else on social media who noticed that he said that in his acceptance speech, but I had to make sure I wasn't also joining the chorus of Black people in the comments to the post that were saying that this is why they can't trust non-Black people of color. And of course, this doesn't even touch on indigenous extermination as part of America's foundation. Again, it's a lot and it's heavy. I know for a fact that Joe deals with this in his own way when he posted about the lack of diversity in the pit of a theater that he was covering on his Substack. People were upset. People don't want to face their participation in racist systems, much less have it on blast. But at the same time, you have people like me who want to name these things without contributing to the further divisiveness. Naming these issues does not mean we're upset at an individual. We're pointing at a system and the people who are participating in that system, all so that we can all do something different. So what really is there to do within this quagmire of racial challenge? For me, I just have to lead with compassion and naming what I'm naming. Zoran was wrong for what he said, in my opinion, and it's evidence of the degree to which many immigrant communities fully participate in the marginalization of Black Americans. And that's another topic for another day. But it just has to be named. And that doesn't mean that I don't support him or that Black folks don't support him. In fact, I think it's a sign that we do support him enough to name the thing, whether he sees it or not, so that we're all learning and that we're all growing. Joe has nothing against the white men who dominate pit orchestras. He simply knows that there's inequity at play, and he's doing his part to raise awareness around it. What do you think about naming the thing while being compassionate and as undivisive as you can be? Is being undivisive something you even care about as you engage these conversations? Because I think that's a part we have to talk about as well. We aren't doing any good if we're perpetuating divisiveness and harm through our equitable activism. It's a really delicate balance. Maybe you think naming and talking about racism in itself is divisive. I don't know, but there's a lot to this, and I don't have all the answers, of course. But what I do know is that I'm on my journey, and many other people are on their journey, and somehow we all have to meet in the middle to progress towards something that benefits everyone. I believe in the human spirit and honor every living thing as precious, so much so that I want to make this world better for all of these precious living beings out here. I hope we can all figure out how to check our egos, check the way we offer and receive messaging around equity and diversity, and really focus on this goal of human happiness and harmony. There's a lot more I can say, but I'll leave it there for now. Just want to put a fine point on it. The activists and the folks who are speaking out, we have to really understand that we can also participate in continued divisiveness and harm if we aren't delivering our message in a way that can be heard. So I hope that you hear that. I appreciate y'all for the continued support. More from me next time. Keep up the good fight with as much compassion as you can. And I'll talk to y'all again next time. Peace.